Welcome, everyone. Glad you could join us. My name is Homa Taheri, and I'm a McKinney Climate Fellow at Indiana Resilience Funding Hub, which is a collaboration between the Environmental Resilience Institute at the Center for Rural Engagement here at Indiana University. Today's webinar is on the Justice40 Initiative. This program directs 40% of the overall benefits of certain federal investments to flow to disadvantaged communities. It encompasses government investments in clean energy and energy efficiency, clean transit, affordable and sustainable housing, training and workforce development, remediation and reduction of legacy pollution, and development of clean water infrastructure. Justice40 aims to address decades of systematic, inequitable historical policies and underinvestment in disadvantaged communities. This initiative aims to bring resources to communities most impacted by climate change, pollution, and environmental hazard. So far, a total of 19 agencies have released their covered programs under the Justice40 Initiative. Grant applicants to these programs need to address the benefits and burdens of projects on disadvantaged communities. Over the past year, the Indiana Resilience Funding Hub has worked with local communities in Indiana in their applications to a set of Justice40 eligible projects to receive funding from the federal government. This collaboration has covered funding opportunities provided by the Departments of Energy and Transportation and the Environmental Protection Agency in this period. The Indiana Resilience Funding Hub has also prepared a report about the Justice40 Initiative, which is available on our website. This report covers more specific information about Justice40 implementation in each of the agencies engaged in this initiative. We will share a link to this report in the chat for your reference. In this webinar, our guest speaker will speak to the Justice40 Initiative implementation at the Environmental Protection Agency. Our special guest today is Matthew Tejada. Matthew is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for Office of Environmental Justice and External Civil Rights at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. You can post your questions in the chat. This webinar is being recorded, and you will be able to find the recording of this webinar and all the previous webinars on our website. Take it away, Matthew.
Thank you so much, Homa, and I'm very happy to be with you all. This was a special request from our Deputy Administrator here at EPA, Janet McCabe. She wasn't able to engage with you all, but she wanted to make sure that you all, your constituency, had the information you need, has the contacts you need in order to really understand how Justice40 is working, what it means in different grant applications, and some of the ways that we are trying at EPA to support communities, overburdened, disadvantaged communities, including with a special emphasis on many rural communities in what is happening across the federal government today. And I think that's especially important to come from the environmental justice program, not only because of things like Justice40 that have really been a historically powerful driver towards really focusing our efforts to implement all of these funding mechanisms, but also because, as it turns out, the environmental justice funding that we have specifically, which I'll talk some about kind of at the end, it really is, it winds up being some of the most flexible funding and hopefully some of the most powerful funding because of that flexibility, where it will really enable communities, that maybe have interest or maybe already have several other streams of funding lined up to really go after some of the toughest environmental, public health, and climate change impacts that we are all struggling with. It can really help stitch those things together in ways that maximize the effectiveness of a lot of other federal programs, or even just state or even private programs. But the thing I wanted to start with today, and if we could go to the first slide, please, is just grounding us, or actually the next slide after that, I guess, grounding us in what we're talking about when we're talking about environmental justice. And for me, that is something that's really important, because when I first joined EPA, I come from Texas. I was working in Houston, Texas. I joined EPA a little over 10 years ago, and I came from running a community-based organization in Houston that worked on these EJ issues, in the Ship Channel, the largest petrochemical corridor in the United States. And when I was hired, I was told, not to talk about environmental racism. And I didn't know why I was being told. I was being actually told, and this was during the Obama administration, I was being told by a senior political appointee of color, don't talk about environmental racism. Just talk about environmental justice. Just say justice. Don't talk about racism. And I didn't know why I was being told that. I didn't even really understand the instruction. And it took me a little while to kind of figure it out, because talking about these things and even just using some of that language, as we're seeing today still, it's really hard for some people to do that. It's really threatening for a lot of folks to use that sort of language, to talk about these sorts of histories. And this is really the first administration in our history that not only is allowing, but is really urging folks to lift up these histories and make the connections between what we are doing today to those histories. So I'm going to talk about just a little sliver of those histories. I could talk about a lot of different things that have happened in our country. I could talk about things that happened before our country was even a thing. I could talk about the treatment of indigenous peoples on this continent for centuries. But the thing I want to talk about, mostly because it's fairly recent, people have generally heard about this, even if they don't fully understand it, but also because it's visual, right? And starting with the visual thing, we're talking about redlining. And most folks have heard about redlining, and they understand it, at a fairly general level, right? That it was this thing that was done, back in the 20th century, that kind of segregated communities of color from white communities. And most people, that's about all they understand it to be, which is, understandable. I want to dig a little deeper though, and I want to make sure that we really hone in on three additional deeper elements to what redlining was, right? And again, just from that general perspective, so redlining was an economic policy. It provided homeowners insurance, government-backed homeowners insurance to families that were taking out mortgages, and it really dictated, right? If you were a white family, you could get that insurance in these places, but if you were a family of color, you could only get that insurance in these other places, right? It was a very effective economic policy that segregated communities. So what we're looking at here, we're looking at Oakland, California. And the first thing that I want folks to understand is even though that this is a policy that was started to get put into place a century ago, and in many instances, right, or in most of our instances, most of our communities were already segregated in the 1920s, but they grew pretty rapidly from the 1920s into like the 60s, right, the beginning of the baby boom and everything else. And what redlining did was it was really effective at cementing that segregation into our communities. And we know that because we can look at any of the over 200 cities in the United States that did this redlining, and we can take those actual maps, because they actually had to create maps, and with colored pencils, they had to like outline the different neighborhoods. We can take those actual historic maps and we can overlay them on a contemporary map. And here you're seeing a map of Oakland, California. You can clearly see the red, yellow, blue, and green lines, but underneath that, you have one of the modern environmental justice screening tools. This is CalEnviroScreen. This is a tool that the state of California specifically created to look at environmental public health justice issues in the state of California. But you can do this for any of the over 200 communities, and they will agree with upwards of 90% consistency, because the maps that were created generations ago are still the way our communities look like today. Those segregated communities of generations ago are still segregated today with upwards of 90% agreement. It was a really effective policy at locking in and determining where people of color would live in the United States and where white people would live in the United States. It was really effective at doing that. So that's the first thing to kind of hone in on, is the effectiveness of it, because it has lasted. Our communities still look like this. The second thing I want folks to key in on is that when all those, urban planners, those proto-urban planners of a century ago, those cartographers or geographers or whoever else they were using to actually draw these maps, when they were drawing those maps, it wasn't just an exercise in kind of outlining certain areas, but they had to justify their decisions. They actually had to, in writing, justify, well, why is this neighborhood going to be outlined in red? And why is this neighborhood going to be outlined in blue or green, right? And the language they used to justify those decisions isn't similar to the language we use today. It's the exact same language, right? The words, the reasons they used for people of color living there and white people living over there is because those places for the people of color, they were already undesirable places to live. They already had smoke and smells and fumes from industry, whether that was early refining and chemical plants or tire manufacturers, or the sewage plants, or the animal slaughterhouses, or the concentrated animal feeding operations, or that the streets were unpaved, that every time it rained there were no sewers, so everything would just turn into a swamp, that the housing stock was in poor disrepair, that there was violence and vandalism and unwanted elements in the community. The exact same sort of things we talk about today that we are struggling to do something about to advance equity and justice across the United States. Those were actually the reasons cited in writing for why communities of color were destined to live in those places. On the flip side, right, the language used to justify where the white communities would live, some of the most common words that you would encounter are green, right? Even 100 years ago, people wanted to live next to parks, because parks was another really big word, right? Streets, lights, good housing. Golf is incredibly frequently encountered in these. Like, people loved golfing even 100 years ago, right? Those were the sorts of things that you'd want to live next to. So those were the justifications for the areas that were green and blue lined on the map. Well, all these other undesirable things, these things that cause challenges to public health, to communities, even before we really had that very developed, science of public health, we knew those weren't the places you'd want to live. So that's where the people of color were sent to go live. If we go forward one more slide, so it was incredibly effective. It was done really purposefully. And on the next slide, we'll see, and we're gonna look at, oh, is it me or is it? Oh, I think somebody's trying. There we go. And now we're looking at Akron, Ohio, right? You can kind of see underneath some of these slides. Akron, Ohio, the redlining map from however long ago still looks like what EJ Screen would tell you. And EJ Screen is the EPA tool that is very similar to Cal EnviroScreen, very similar to a number of other state-based screening tools. They line up the language, right? This was actually this particular neighborhood was actually the neighborhood that was right next to the Goodrich Rubber Company in Akron, Ohio. That it was already kind of a dirty, smelly place to live, not a really good, desirable place to live. But the thing I want to see, make sure folks see here, is that for the folks living in this neighborhood today, all right, if you look at the modern data associated with residents in this community today, and if you look at diabetes, high blood pressure, pulmonary diseases, mental health issues, or just simple life expectancy, the people living in this community today are still suffering from decisions made 100 years ago, right? The kids who aren't even born yet, but will live in this community tomorrow, they're going to suffer from racist decisions made 100 years ago. This to me is one of the best illustrations of why things like Justice 40 are really important. Because in my over 15 years of advocating for equity and justice, whether it was in Houston or now in DC at EPA, and no matter if I'm, speaking to folks externally or talking to folks in industry or talking to my colleagues in the federal government, a lot of folks will say, well, why do I need to care about this? Right? Why, that's not my job. I didn't do that. Isn't this just a matter of personal decision making and responsibility? Or isn't this just the outcome of uncontrollable economic forces? Or, I'm not the one that did this. Why should I be the one to do something about it? And what I really want to challenge folks to understand is, no, we individuals that are on this call today, we did not do this. None of us were alive back then to do these things, right? But our society did. Our society did it very purposefully because we have the language where they knew exactly why they were sending people to live in certain places. They did it very effectively because those decisions have determined what our communities still look like a century later. And it's still impacting people's health in devastating ways. So even though we're not responsible for making the decisions, right, we as members of this society, I believe, all have a responsibility to understand these histories and to do something about it. And that understanding and that responsibility is really one of the things that underlies a policy like the Justice40 Initiative, which is saying, look, there's communities across the United States that have been oppressed for a long time. And the results of that oppression didn't just evaporate in the 60s. We have scientific evidence that those impacts are persisting to this day. These are the same communities that as the climate is changing and as communities are being impacted by that climate change, they're the ones that are on the first line of it. They get hit first, they get hit worst, and they have the least ability to do anything about it. And part of that is because they've been disinvested in for so long, right? Aside from redlining, we could look at just, public investment patterns throughout the 20th century that have led to communities being far more vulnerable, being far more fragile to any sort of challenge, whether that's from a pollution source or from, extreme weather events caused by climate change. We all have a responsibility, whether we're in the government, whether we're in academia, whether we're in philanthropy, or whether we're in the private sector, to understand that these are real impacts that communities are suffering for. And we all have a responsibility and an opportunity to do something about it. And Justice 40 is asking us, is really telling us to recognize that and to ensure that at least 40% of the benefits of all these programs that are flowing out of the government right now account for it. Right? That the communities that need and deserve the help most should get the help that they need and deserve. So if we go forward another slide, I think the next slide is just talking about all the different things that we have going on.
Really quick, we do have a question, I think, if you want to address it right as it's come up. Normally I save questions for the end, but one of the people asked if redlining maps were only made for bigger towns and cities.
Yeah, it wasn't every single city in the United States. I think it was somewhere around like 230 or 240, and it was generally, I don't think it was like a hard population cutoff, but I think it was, you had to be, I think it was around like 50,000 or so or more in population size to undergo that redlining. So it wasn't every single community in the United States, but it was in the earlier part of the 20th century. It was the higher population parts of the United States. And you see, I have some, there's some links on here, and I think folks are going to be able to access my presentation afterwards. These first two slides are taken from the University of Richmond has some scholars and actually has a lab that is really focused on this. And you can go in there and they actually have archives of all these different documents, of all the different maps. They have a lot deeper levels of explanation, and you can actually look at kind of city by city, community by community at these different maps. I think we also, and I'll get to it in a minute, a lot of the more modern screening tools, including EJ Screen, you can now just pull those redlining maps, or you can actually see those redlining maps transposed on these newer screening tools. And I'll talk about that a little bit in a minute when we get to the EJ Screen slide. Going back to the fact, though, that this is a really historic time in our country, in this administration for equity and justice. If we were doing the Justice40 Initiative, if that was all we were doing in this government to advance equity and justice in the United States, it would be historic. It would be the single biggest thing we have going on, just that one policy mandate. And it's one of a few dozen things, actually, whether it's the multiple executive orders that the president has signed, going back to his very first day in office, Executive Order 13985 on advancing racial equity in the United States. He signed that on his first day in office, January 20th, 2021. He signed multiple executive orders that are dealing more explicitly, more directly with environmental justice issues, including an updated Executive Order 14096 that he just signed this past April. The advance of screening tools and the use of screening tools. So it's not just tools like EPA's EJ Screen or California's CalEnviro Screen. We now have the Climate Economic Justice Screening Tool, which is part of the Justice40 Initiative, to actually define which communities in the United States are disadvantaged and that they should be the ones to receive at least the 40% of benefits from all these different programs, right? So that CJES tool, that's what we call the Climate Economic Justice Screening Tool, it really took a huge step forward in terms of, not a tool just to kind of analyze and to think about, but a tool that's actually driving decision-making for a lot of benefits in hundreds, if not thousands, of programs across the United States. We have actual strategic plans where EPA and other federal agencies are actually putting down on paper for the first time ever real, tangible, accountable commitments to how they are going to advance equity and justice in their programs, in their agencies. Here at EPA, we've actually changed the structure of EPA. The program that I've been very privileged to lead for the last 10 years, the EJ program, we used to be a very small program. We were about 40 people across the whole nation, around 25, 30 of us here in headquarters. We had one person in each of the 10 EPA regions, and we were so small, we were kind of nested inside of other parts of the agency. Because of some of the funding we've received, both from the Inflation Reduction Act, as well as from our baseline annual appropriation, the thing that people in this town are fighting over right now, and that we might shut down over. But we've actually received increases in that appropriation the last couple of years. So we've actually grown. We've gone from an organization of about 40 people to 400 people. And most of those people are going to be out in our regions. Our regions are going from one person working on environmental justice to close to 30 people working on environmental justice in every region. So between 250 and 300 people will be scattered out across the United States just working on EJ through EPA's regional offices. And we've also, here in headquarters, we've been combined with our external civil rights compliance office and our dispute resolution office, and we've been stood up into our own national program, which to a bureaucrat, that's something that gets us all excited because it means that we're actually now, our program stands shoulder to shoulder with the air program, with the water program, with the enforcement and compliance program. So we are now structurally an equal part of achieving environmental public health protection in the United States as those other programs. It's an unequivocal signal that in order for us, because environmental public health protection in the United States is a federalist process, right? It's the federal government working with states, working with local governments, for that whole system to really achieve our mission of protecting environmental and public health of all peoples in the United States, you have to advance environmental justice and comply with civil rights laws in order to achieve that mission. If we go on to the next slide, and then I promise you pretty quickly, we're going to get to the actual resources. Just some of the things that are our real priorities this year for our program, obviously just standing the program up. We're doing a lot of hiring right now. We have some big policy commitments on things like how to integrate cumulative impacts into our decision-making, how to actually come up with real measures of meaningful change on the ground that prove that we're having an impact. And the thing that we're really looking at are disparities that exist in society, those ongoing disparities that really shouldn't exist, right? The fact that if you are a Black child in the United States, you're many times more likely to have a dangerous amount of lead in your blood than if you're a white child. There's no biological reason why Black kids magically attract more lead than white kids, right? It's because of where Black kids grow up. Or if you're a Hispanic child in the United States, you're much more likely to have asthma than if you're a white kid. Hispanic kids don't have some genetic thing that causes asthma. It's because of where they grow up, right? So those sorts of disparities, we actually are committing ourselves to eliminating in the United States through our efforts. And then, of course, we're also, in addition to hiring a bunch of staff, we are spending a whole bunch of money. We used to have, for a long time, our grant program was right around $1.5 million, $1.5 million per year total for the entire United States, right? Which is really kind of laughable. That's not much of a grant program. But for most of our history, we were the largest environmental justice grant program in the United States. Over the next few years, we're actually going to be spending over $3 billion in grants and technical assistance, and that's obviously what I'm going to finish on. We're going to spend the most time talking about. If we go forward one more slide. We can skip these next two actually, so we can get to the good stuff. One more. Want to make sure folks know about this. So EJ Screen is our nationally consistent environmental justice screening tool. It takes environmental data, and you can look at that environmental data all by itself, and it actually maps it at a very fine spatial resolution. It's the finest spatial resolution we can achieve. It's at the census block group level. All right, so you can look at that environmental data all by itself, and you can see block group by block group, which are the places that are likely have the biggest pollution challenges across the entire United States. Or you could just zoom in on the state of Indiana. You can see right up at the top, you see it says compare to US or compare to state. You can say compare to state, and then you can just see all those block groups as compared to the other block groups in the state of Indiana. So you can see which of the block groups in Indiana are having the toughest time with pollution potentially. You can also just look at the population. So it uses the census really, really heavily in looking at, which are the most vulnerable communities, right? Which communities are going to have the hardest time dealing with pollution. And then it also combines those two things and actually gives you environmental justice indexes where you see that confluence of burden with vulnerability. And that's what environmental justice is really looking for, right? We're looking for those communities that, because of being communities of color and low income communities and indigenous communities, that vulnerability combined with the fact that they're overburdened by pollution, that they really are the ones that deserve our attention the most. So it is different from the climate economic justice screening tool in that it doesn't draw borders around communities and call them EJ communities or not. It really empowers the individual user to come into touch with a lot of different information that is put very simply and very transparently at your fingertips. You know, information that would have taken folks months and months to compile all by themselves. It makes it instantaneous. It does it at a very fine spatial resolution. And it really allows you to start looking at, okay, which communities in my area really are the ones where we should probably be showing up first and figuring out what is going on. And this is a tool, again, where you can pull in on one of the layers. You can just click on the redlining maps and you can start to see for yourself, right? What do those redlining maps look like with the more modern data? If we go on to the next slide to start talking about the actual Justice40 initiative. So one thing that a lot of folks have had a really hard time understanding, and folks are still having a hard time understanding it, is that Justice40 was not an appropriation, right? There's not a Justice40 grant you can go get. There's not a Justice40 pot of money sitting out there that those disadvantaged communities can go get to. And I think part of that is one, it's actually a fairly complex policy, even though it's fairly simply put on paper, right? That 40% of the benefits of certain federal investments should flow to disadvantaged communities. Part of it's because there's a lot of nuance contained in that very simple policy mandate. It's also because it's really kind of borrowing from something else that happened in California. California actually did have a big pot of money. They had a climate tax that they put in place out in California, and they said okay, we're going to take 40% of the revenue of this climate tax and we're going to give it to certain communities. So in California, they actually did. They had a big pot of money. They took 40% of it out of it and they said, okay, disadvantaged communities, what do you need it for? That is not what is happening in the federal Justice40 initiative, because we don't have a single pot of money. We have hundreds of different pots of money, right? We have hundreds of different programs. So Justice40, we actually went through a process early in this administration. Every agency, every federal department and agency, the White House sent us instructions, and we went through all of our programs to assess, okay, is this a program that should be covered under Justice40? And most of the federal agencies now have lists on their websites, and you have the link here that you should be able to click on when you actually get the presentation, where you can see EPA's Justice40 programs. At EPA, it is the majority of the things we do are Justice40 programs, not only by the count of programs. You know, I think we have over 100 different programs at EPA easily. We have around 80 programs that are Justice40 programs, or if you even just look at the amount of money we have, right? The vast majority of the money that we actually put out through EPA is being covered by Justice40. So it's covering these different programs, right? And the mandate is that at least 40% of the benefits of those programs should go to disadvantaged communities. So we now have the climate and economic justice screening tool that, for the first time ever, as I mentioned before, it has created a map of the entire United States. They're not using census block groups. They're actually using a slightly bigger geography, kind of the next step up. They're using census tracts, but they've gone across the entire map of the United States, and they have colored in the census tracts that are disadvantaged versus tracts that aren't. And the tracts that are colored in, and there's a website with a whole explanation and algorithm and everything else, but the tracts that are colored in are those disadvantaged community tracts that the 40% of the benefits of those programs should flow to. So we have lists of the programs. We have a map that tells you where the disadvantaged communities are. The last thing that we're working on right now still is the benefits piece. And benefits is really tricky. The easiest part of benefits are just the dollars, right? Where do the actual investments go? And if you work in government, you know, we don't always know where the dollars go. Especially from the federal side, a lot of the time, you know, once we send the money to Indianapolis or to wherever, once we send it to the state capital of any given state, we at the federal government might not know where it goes after that, right? So just tracking the investments as a benefit is a challenge that we're working on right now, so that we can actually track the dollar down to, okay, where was it actually spent on the ground, right? Whose pipes did it replace? Whose stormwater did it fix? Whose house did it improve? So we're working on actually following the dollar, but it's also not just dollars. Like one of the things that is included in Justice 40 is a lot of our compliance work, right? Making sure that polluting industries are in compliance. That takes a lot of staff time and hours. It takes travel dollars. It takes, just the effort of the government. So we're also trying to characterize, well, how do we track the benefits of those sorts of programs, right? Because if we're out there reducing pollution by bringing companies into compliance with laws, that's a benefit. And that's the sort of benefit that we want to track. So when you're looking at, from y'all's perspective, right, which programs you're interested in, whether it's an EPA program or another federal agency, really looking at, well, where is the place of performance of your project? Which community are you helping? Which community are you working in? And what sort of benefits does your project accrue for that community? That's the sort of stuff that you're going to be looking for in your applications for different funding, right? Is to be very, very clear that this grant is proposing activities that benefit this community, very specifically which actual geographic community it is, and that these are the actual ways this project will benefit that community. Those are the sorts of things that programs across the federal government, EPA or others, that's what we're looking for in a lot of our grants right now, to make sure that we're hitting those mandates that the president put out for us. If we go to the last slide, and then we should have a good amount of time for some questions. Just want to make sure folks know what we're doing with the EJ money we received in the Inflation Reduction Act at EPA, because it's really enabling us for the first time to stand up a holistic community support program that folks in the EJ movement have been asking for a long time, right? Because communities, as I'm sure you all know, communities are at different places on their journey, right? There are some communities, they have some really great local leadership. They have an academic institution maybe partnering with them or local. They've got a really strong nonprofit community-based organization. And it's like they just need $15 million and they are ready to make something happen, right? They know what their issue is, they know how to solve it, they just need some support and they are ready to go. There's lots of other communities, especially rural communities, right? They're just starting to figure it out. And those are some of the ones that can be the toughest, because those are the places where there's not an academic institution very close. There's not even a nonprofit. It's kind of the city is probably the only entity within 50 miles, and the city's only got 2 paid staffers, right? And everyone else is volunteering their time. So those folks need a different level of help. They need some basic help in understanding how to write a good grant, which grant should they go for, how do they implement it effectively, and they need that to be done as simply as possible. So we're standing up this multi-phased program where, depending upon where a community is in their development, we'll have different levels of both technical assistance and financial assistance to meet the needs of those communities. And the backbone of it all is the first thing we started working on, and you can just Google this and it'll take you to a website laying it all out, are TICTACs, our Thriving Community Technical Assistance Centers. And these centers we've already stood up. There's 13 of them across the United States, and there's 3 national ones. And we're still working on a couple more regional ones out in the Rocky Mountain area and up in New England. And these technical assistance centers are going to be the ground floor, front door for communities, rural local governments, tribal governments, community-based organizations, faith-based organizations that want to start developing their skills to draw down these resources to be able to compete for these Justice 40 benefits. They can go and knock on that door. There's no application necessary. All you got to do is call, and these TICTACs are going to be there to help train them on how to write a grant, to help identify, which is the first grant they should go after, to help put them into contact with more specialized forms of technical assistance, right? If folks need to develop the actual project to get their water system in line, or if they need more specialized help dealing with some waste sites, right? Those other forms of assistance are out there, but it's so hard sometimes for a lot of communities to find those resources. So the Tic Tacs are going to be there to navigate folks to those other forms of assistance. So those have already been announced. We're working to open their doors. Some of them already have their doors open. Some of them are still opening them up. In Region 5, you actually have a couple, the University of Minnesota and Blacks and Green, which is a community-based organization out of Chicago. They're both going to be providing support across Region 5, including Indiana, and they have partners in Indiana. If you Google Tic Tacs, you can go to the website, and it lists all the different partners for all the different centers. And we've got partners across the United States. Not every single state has a partner, but we've got partners pretty broadly across the United States. Another thing that we're going to launch this fall, we'll actually be announcing these in November, because the Tic Tacs are out there providing technical assistance, but folks still need financial assistance to get started, right? They need to be able to pay someone, they need to be able to buy some equipment, they need to be able to do some monitoring or some figuring out. So we're going to be announcing some grant makers this fall, because those capacity constrained communities like rural local governments, they can't fill out the whole federal grant application and go through the acquisition process for $200,000, right? It's a huge burden for a really small payoff, but that's kind of what they need to get going. They need a couple $100,000. So we're going to be deploying 10 regional and 1 national grant maker, where we're going to give over $500 million to these grant makers. They've already done the really complicated federal application, and then they're going to turn around and start giving out subawards of those $500 million in smaller chunks, from between $150,000 to $350,000 to those capacity constrained organizations. And that means that those organizations, they'll still have to apply for it, but it'll be a real simplified application that they'll send just directly to the grant maker, and the grant maker will be able to turn around and make awards much more quickly than the federal government is, right? It typically takes us about 9 months to complete a grant cycle. We're going to be looking for these grant makers to do it in weeks, and to spread out and provide thousands of these subawards across the United States in those smaller increments that capacity constrained communities need just to get started. And then also in October, we'll be releasing kind of the biggest piece of all of this. We call it our EJ Community Change Grant. And this will really be for communities that already have some capacity. They've identified what their big challenges are, but they need $20 million to get started, right? So we'll be releasing a community change grant in October that'll be providing awards from between $10 and $20 million for partnerships of communities. And you need to have either a couple of community-based organizations, a couple of nonprofits, or a community-based nonprofit that's working with a local government, or working with a tribal government, or working with an academic institution. And that they actually put that in the statute. The only people we can give this Inflation Reduction Act money to from the EJ program, it's a partnership between a couple of community-based organizations, or a partnership between a community-based organization and a tribe, a local government, or an academic institution. But we'll be giving them between $10 and $20 million to work on both pollution and climate change projects in their community, to really catalyze change happening on the ground in their community. And we're really trying to focus that grant in on, I don't want to pay for things that other programs just got a bunch of money for, right? I don't want to pay to take lead pipes out of the ground, because we've got a bunch of money right now to take lead pipes out of the ground. But the disadvantaged communities, there's always a gap to get them ready to access all of those other resources. And that's what I want to pay for. I want our grants to fill that gap, so that no other program across the federal government has any excuse not to fund the other efforts to actually start improving the conditions in those communities. So that's going to be coming out in October. A couple other things that we're going to do. So that is still going to be a grant that folks have to come to EPA to apply for. But when we announce it in October, instead of having everyone apply by a deadline, we're going to have a year-long rolling application period, right? So as soon as folks are ready to come in with a proposal between $10 and $20 million, We're going to be scoring those as they come in, and we're going to be awarding them throughout that year, right? To try to get folks awards as soon as they can. We're going to have a two-part application process where we'll have the written application, which is going to be pretty straightforward, right? And we'll score that written application. And anybody that has all their stuff together and has all their written documentation and it all makes sense, we're then going to invite folks in for an oral interview, right? Because we actually want to talk to those partners, right? We want to hear directly from the community organization, you know, this is what we really need, and these really are true partners to us, and this is what the sustainability is going to look like, and this is why this is such an important project. We want to talk directly to the applicants, right? And not just have professional grant writers determining who does or does not get it. We're also, the other thing that year-long application period is going to do, because I used to, you know, when I used to run a community-based organization in Houston, I used to apply for the EJ grants and I never got one. And I know exactly how much time it takes to sit down and write one of these grants and get all your partners lined up and everything else. And then when you don't get it, it's like all this sunk cost is just wasted. So what the year-long application period is going to do is when you're ready and when you come in and apply, if you don't succeed, if you don't get it, we're going to debrief you. We're going to give you some feedback on why you didn't get it, and you're going to get to reapply, right? Because if you're sinking the cost into putting together one of these proposals, we want to get you the money, right? We want to give you at least we want to give you a chance to come back with a revised proposal and get that proposal funded. So that should be kicking off in October. We really look forward to folks applying to it. It's the first time we're doing it, so we're not real sure what to expect out of it. But I'm hoping that in at least a couple hundred places across the United States, that these grants are really going to be catalytic at making significant change happen, at improving circumstances where there are some really tough environmental, public health, and climate challenges facing the community. So I'll stop there. I think I talked longer than I intended, but I hope it was useful, and I'm happy to take any questions. And you can email me if you need anything else. Please don't hesitate to.
So I think that we've had a couple of different questions in the Zoom chat. It looks like one of them is whether communities are legally required to use the tract level designation of disadvantage. And kind of related to that, are individual communities required to hit the 40% threshold for their grant expenditures?
No. Individual communities, that 40% isn't something that transfers to like a project, right? That's a goal for the federal government. We're supposed to make sure that overall, at least 40% is going to those disadvantaged communities. So that's, please don't think that in your proposal, you have to say like, well, 42% is, right? Really, we want, and actually some of the Inflation Reduction Act programs, it's mandated that 100% of the benefits of those programs go to disadvantaged communities, not just 40%. The important thing for applicants is, you know, I hope you're thinking about, if you're going for a grant, that it's going to go to the community of greatest need, and just making sure that you characterize that community as a disadvantaged community. So using the CGIS tool, right? Like saying, well, here's where this is going to go, and this project is going to happen in this census tract, and that census tract is designated as disadvantaged, then you're in, right? All you got to do is make sure that you very clearly show that, explain that in your application. And it's not everything, right? Even if you're not in the climate, even if the place of performance is not in the climate economic justice screening tool, a lot of our grants will have some other flexibilities in there. For example, the EJ grants, you know, I fully expect some of our EJ grants to go for, you know, rural and incorporated communities that are just kind of spread out. So like farm worker communities, right? Farm worker communities, you can't really define them geographically. People are migrant, people move around. So those sorts of communities, you can't map them, so you can still claim them and we can still fund them as a disadvantaged community. You just have to make sure in your proposal that you describe what the community is, and if it falls outside of one of these maps, that you kind of explain why this is a disadvantaged community, right? Give every opportunity for us to understand, you know, who's actually going to receive the benefit of it.
Thank you. Another grant, or another question, sorry, my bad,
Yeah.
is off the top of your head, do you know if the Justice40 at EPA works with the HUD Healthy Homes program, or are they completely
Yeah, we work closely with HUD, and we work closely with the Healthy Homes program, and that's actually one of the ones, you know, when I was mentioning, right, we don't want to pay for stuff that other folks are paying for. You know, there's some limitations to what the Healthy Homes program can do. Although recently, from what I understand, the Healthy Homes program has gotten really flexible in terms of different ways to kind of work on lead issues, especially in homes. So we work closely with HUD in a number of different ways. But looking at like an EJ grant, we fund every year. We fund tons of lead related projects, whether it's lead remediation or awareness or training or educational campaigns or testing campaigns, you know, things that maybe Healthy Homes hasn't had as much money in the past. They have a bunch of money right now. But again, there's sometimes gaps that the community needs to fill in order to make most use of something like a HUD Healthy Home project. So that's the sort of gap that we're trying to fill with our EJ grants. But that's the way it's really incumbent upon the community again to be aware that there's different programs across the federal government that do different things. And it's not like one means if you get one, it doesn't necessarily mean you get the next, but we're trying to make it as easy and aligned as possible so that, you know, different programs that do different things can try to come into individual communities to be part of a more holistic project.
Thank you. Another question is, for communities looking at the political calendar, should they be concerned about trying to develop a multi-year grant when the House is considering defunding some of the IRA initiatives? This person has said, in other words, can future legislative action claw back grant awards after they've been already awarded?
Once they're awarded, from what I understand, once you're awarded, that is a legally binding contract of the government. So I think once a grant is awarded, you're good. That's not to say somebody in a potential future administration doesn't try, but those are legally binding contracts that the government enters into. And I don't anticipate that somebody's going to make a run at trying to undo grant awards. Now, there is a real concern that any money that hasn't been awarded could be pulled back. So, you know, people that are in the process of getting awards or competitions that are open, but people are still working on their applications. There is certainly a potential if there's a change in administration, or even, you know, depending upon the outcome of what these budget negotiations lead to, there's a potential that some of this, you know, gets smaller or goes away. I don't think a lot of it is just going to go away. I think some programs that were funded by the Inflation Reduction Act might be in for a haircut coming up. And that does mean, you know, to get as ready as you can, as early as you can, and apply as quickly as you can when you've identified programs that you're interested in. Don't wait until the very end. Don't wait until the deadline if you can get it in earlier. Get yourself as in front of that line as you can, and really be diligent, especially if you've already gone the application process and you've been awarded, to be diligent about moving into the award phase, because that really relies a lot on the applicant. You know, once you've been selected for a lot of awards, then doing all the financial stuff to actually receive the award, really being diligent about being on top of, getting the forms in, getting the things signed, getting everything negotiated, and getting into award. That's the safest place you need to get to, and you need to get there as quickly as you can.
You. And for one last question, we have, is projected population growth for communities taken into consideration? Or are we simply talking about, current and past population numbers?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry, actually, there's also one,
Sure.
and then one more other question before we close out, and these will probably be our last two, but after that one, is there a reporting process when funds are being misused?
Yeah, so on the first one, the maps that we're using for like disadvantaged community or other stuff, they do not take into account population growth. That could certainly be something though to mention in a potential proposal, right? That, hey, here's what's actually happening on the ground. Here's why this area, it's getting overcrowded, low housing stock, unhealthy housing. Like that's certainly the sort of stuff, that folks would be interested in and be looking for in a proposal. But the maps themselves are not contemplating population growth. And then you absolutely reporting and looking for fraud, waste, and abuse is a huge concern. There's obviously a ton of money out there. We've all been reading the news about what has happened with some of the COVID relief money. There's a lot of concern of not repeating that and being very careful and diligent about it. For us, with the grants we're giving out, not only are we going to have a lot of technical assistance for grantees to get ready to propose stuff, but even once we award those grants, we're going to have other forms of technical assistance to the projects that get funded to make sure that they are staying on top of their reporting, their tracking, their financials. So we're going to have external support as well as our own folks internally really working with the grantees and minding shop very closely to help folks stay in compliance and to look for folks that might be trying to get up to no good. I think that was it, yeah, Anna?
I believe so. Thank you so much for talking. And Homa, do you want to take it away, close out our webinar?
Yeah. So thank you, and thank you for the your great presentation, Matthew, and for the great questions that our attendees asked. Feel free to use the contact form that I shared earlier in the chat for any follow-up questions or contacting Matthew as he kindly suggested. And please join us for our follow-up for our next webinar, which will be on October 3rd. It's about solar smart, and the registration for link is also in the chat. And that's it. Thank you. Thank you all.
Thanks, everyone.